Now let's begin with a simple question. What is The Handmaiden? Well, The Handmaiden is a South Korean film from 2016, directed by Park Chan-wook, perhaps best known for the disturbing, gory, and packed with shock value thriller Oldboy, released way back in 2003. The same year Memories of Murder came out, a quite famous movie in itself. Now, Park has directed a lot of movies, from Lady Vengeance in 2005 to Stoker in 2013. Admittedly, here in the West, not as many Korean films reach the mainstream market for movies or TV. Titles such as the historic Best Picture Parasite and other films such as A Tale of Two Sisters and The Host have been marketed, and let's not forget about Squid Game. But if I were to go out and ask individuals on the street right now if they had seen the Handmaiden movie specifically, they would likely shake their heads unless they were like me and just really liked Eastern entertainment. So, The Handmaiden. Just a quick synopsis, The Handmaiden takes place in the 1930s, during the Japanese imperial occupation of Korea in the onslaught of World War II. We follow Suki, a girl from a poor Korean family entangled in a plot with the fake Count Fujiwara to marry, lock away, and bankrupt a Japanese heiress, Hideko. Throughout the film, we learn of an enduring love blossoming between Suki, the handmaiden, and Hideko. Told in 3 parts, the film goes over the events of the story, from the Count's plan coming to a head, to Hideko's past being revealed, to a retelling of the film from alternate viewpoints in the 3rd act, which eventually all boils down to the 2 women running away together and the Count meeting his unprecedented demise. I mean, what other film have you seen where 2 men get poisoned in a secret basement torture chamber next to a man-eating octopus in a tank half its size? Absolutely 10 out of 10 genius Oscar-induced imagery, if I do say so myself. But what is it about The Handmaiden that makes it such a vibrant and memorable watch? Well, the first thing I noticed was the soundtrack. Now, in a very interesting way, The Handmaiden is a movie consisting of quite a few cultural references fused together in film. Throughout the story, the arrogance of World War Japanese imperial nationalism is shown in the way that the fake Count uses his quote-unquote Japanese background to lord over Hideko and others. So what does this have to do with the music? Well, the score is intricately woven into the movie. Take the sequence in the 3rd act, for instance, where Hideko and Suki rip up the art books and escape to Japan. The music doesn't just accent this scene, it dominates it alongside the visuals. The vicarious nature of the narrative itself sets a perfect stage for the music to thunder in, commanding a dramatic, optimistic, and slightly sad atmosphere that coats the subsequent scenes in a rift of orchestral impact, each adding dynamic feeling to the story's increasing climax. It's building up to something big. You can see it, you can feel it. Other parts of the film use music more as an accent piece to the overall aesthetic, such as the 1st act, where music simply lingers in the background. It seems to be hinting there's more to come, and as the acts go on, we enter new forms of the narrative, and so do we musically. The soundtrack seems to become louder, flowing from a small trickle in the 1st act to a roaring waterfall in the end. In other words, as the film goes on, the music helps to establish a slow build-up that eventually climaxes before its ultimate conclusion. And of course, we can't forget the beautiful closing song by Min-hee and Gain. Definitely check them out. So we're still naming positives, things I really liked about the movie. Keeping in those positives, the next thing that stuck out to me was the atmosphere of the film. Now, this movie felt like a fusion of cultural dynamics, not only Korean, and it's no secret that many Korean directors are involved in projects with Western productions. Just look at Park Stoker from 2013 or Bong Joon-ho's film Snowpiercer. We can assume that these films wouldn't feel Korean, as they have Western actors and are ultimately made by Western companies. But what makes a film feel distinctly Korean? Well, I'm no expert, of course, my opinions are subjective and in no way unbiased. But to me anyway, a Korean film is simply a film that expresses the cultures, i.e. the score, the acting, cinematography, dynamic, and the setting of Korea. In this case, of course, we're talking about South Korea. But what about The Handmaiden? See, with Snowpiercer and Stoker, those movies have Korean directors, but are more or less Western productions. However, despite being very loosely based off of a novel from the UK, The Handmaiden does not reflect the feeling of a quote-unquote Korean movie in my opinion. Rather, it scales closer to the feeling that I get when I watch a British film. The specific framing of each scene, the many class references, the Western-style houses, well, partially Western anyway, The outfits and of course the music all lend to this effect. I'm no music theorist, but I do seem to find that something about the way The Handmaiden is scored reminds me more of a modern European composer than anything Asian inspired. If you have anything to add on this or can explain this in better detail, then please let me know in the comments below. And it's not to say that other movies from South Korea don't have great cinematography, acting, music, etc. They absolutely do. Movies like A Tale of Two Sisters and even television series such as Hotel de Luna and Squid Game have a lot of great acting, cinematography, and music. Every culture has good films, and South Korea is no exception. It's just that there's definitely something about The Handmaiden that feels like it's trying to be more exotic, more far-reaching or something, setting itself apart from the atmosphere most Korean films have given me, which has been a bit cozier and in many ways personal and intimate. This movie, in contrast, feels more formulaic and cold, and that's part of the brilliance. While a movie like Parasite is pretty big budget and now mainstream, it retains its Korean aesthetic and charm, from its comedy to its underlying messages. But The Handmaiden feels like an English or American Hollywood blockbuster. The sex is absolutely wild, the costumes are expensive and overstated, the set's extremely lush, and the soundtrack, well, we've already been there. And in a lot of cases this might have not worked, but here I definitely think it does. It makes The Handmaiden feel very special. And going into the story, things only get better. The Handmaiden is a lush depiction of a tricky romance between two women and the difficulties facing South Koreans under the tyranny of Japanese occupation during the first half of the 20th century. I never found myself bored during this movie. Rather, it got more and more interesting as the audience learned of Hideko's background in the underground pleasure industry of rich men and the psychological damage each character goes through over the course of the film. The camera work is extremely well done. Every scene in this movie feels heavy, as if it has a huge purpose in the story, and in a word, the second and third acts can be summed up as absolutely riveting. The stakes get higher and higher, and at the end of the day, I was stunned the first time I saw this movie. It was truly breathtaking. But as I watched it over again, I wanted to get an honest opinion on what I really thought after some time had passed. So here's what I have to say. Now, we've discussed the plot, the music, and the atmosphere. Let's delve into the details, things that stuck out to me the most. To start, the plot twist at the end of the first act completely threw me off guard. I mean, I was pretty sure Suki and Hideko were just gonna ditch the Count and set off to see the world together, which, to be fair, was pretty much what they ended up doing, but the way the movie told it was not at all linear, and that's the thing. The story scenes all came together and held their greatest significance when I went and rewatched the movie a few more times. And yeah, adding to the point, this is definitely the kind of movie you'll want to rewatch to fully understand the significance of the symbols and elements scattered throughout the story. There's Suki's stolen shoe, the rope, the half-Japanese, half-Western style estate, just to name a few. But here's the thing, the richness of the characters and the setting plays off to a very dark and disturbing plot. Of course, no character is innocent, and no one in this movie is objectively good. Maybe except Hideko's aunt, who unfortunately hanged herself from a rope. But just the fact that Hideko keeps the rope that her aunt killed herself with in her room alludes to the fact that these characters are not in any way normal people. They have a lot of baggage with them from years of severe emotional abuse. Suki is mischievous with a touch of kindness and passion. The Count is cunning, with his passions lying in the degenerative side of things, and Hideko, well, she's probably the most interesting character. I say this because even after the credits roll on my third or fourth watch of this film, I'm still not quite sure how well I know her personality. The only thing that I can trust is that she really loves Suki. Hideko, mostly a platonic and unresponsive character throughout the first two acts, ends up seeming more cunning than even Suki or the Count. Of course, this is likely due to her plan to escape the fate of having to marry her evil uncle, a man who meets a fitting end, I might add. But Hideko is complex, as are all of the characters in this story, and that's another reason why I find her to be a harder character to gauge. The movie presents her in the first act as innocent, calm, and weak and naive. But then in an instant, as Suki gets locked up in Hideko's place at the mental hospital, all of that gets turned around, and we see this really weird smile curl up on the heiress's face. Now, moving into things that made me scratch my head with this movie, Well, I had to mention this. What I don't get is how this specific event I just mentioned ties into the third act, where Hideko plans for Suki to escape. To recap, at the end of Act 1, Suki is like, "Oh boy, the madam was actually evil the whole time and is locking me up against my will in a mental hospital when it was supposed to be her," and she says this directly to the viewers. Or thinks it directly to the viewers, indicating a huge betrayal that she was not anticipating. But then later we learn that it was all planned before we cut to Hideko helping Suki escape so that they can run off together in the third act. But what about Suki's inner dialogue saying she was deceived in Act 1?
그분은 처음부터 그냥 나쁜 년이다.
If Suki had known all along that Hideko was going to break her out of the hospital, trick the Count, and that they were together on this, then why would she have thought, "Oh, Hideko is evil," for the entire audience to hear? This creates a pretty big plot hole, mainly because the audience no longer understands the relationship between these two women in the middle of the film. It gets really muddy. It's only revealed later in Act 3 that Hideko never betrayed Suki. So if the script had literally just left Suki's inner thoughts out of that scene entirely, this story would have stayed coherent instead of making her seem mentally inconsistent from the first act to the third act. Which ultimately means my biggest gripe with this movie was an entirely avoidable mistake. And seeing it in a film this focused on being detail-oriented and meticulous in its storytelling is just disappointing. Because honestly, this is just a silly rookie script mistake, easily fixable. Anyway, it breaks the immersion, and I really had to step back from calling this story a complete masterpiece because of it, which is honestly just a shame. It by no means ruins the story, but felt like a big hole in the patchwork that didn't need to be there at all. And with that, I also feel it's important to address that this movie has had a lot of controversy around it, mostly having to do with the actress min-hee who played Hideko, actually having a real-life relationship with a married Korean director, Sang-Soo. Yeah, things got a bit messy for a while. I've heard Hong's wife and him were living apart at the time they got together, but she refused to divorce him. I've heard there was harassment to some end. But honestly, I'm not really going to put my opinion in on this one. This is pretty old information anyway, and one thing I can say for sure, even now several years later, if you search up Kim Min-hee on Google Images, it'll most likely be pictures of her with the director, talking about Scandal. And like I said, I don't really have an opinion on this, it kind of just is what it is. I'm just putting it in the video because we're talking about The Handmaiden, and I felt it was appropriate to add. Even the media didn't really know how to react to this film when it came out, including all the scandal around it. And yet this event probably was the most appropriate thing to happen around a movie like The Handmaiden, which pretty much was made with the intention to cause shock and awe. We've seen this before with Oldboy, but one thing Oldboy didn't show us much was sex. Yeah, YouTube's probably demonetizing me for this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's my video. But for anyone who doesn't want to hear this part for personal reasons or just not being comfortable with sex scenes, I completely understand. Timestamps on the screen if you desire to skip this section. Anyway, moving on to the sex. This movie has a lot of sex. Whether it be a bunch of high-profile men in a room listening to erotic stories told and demonstrated with mannequins, or just scenes bordering on straight-up pornography between Suki and Hideko, there's a lot of that kind of kinky stuff going on. And I know it's in the director Park's nature to do these kind of shocking things, but I would argue that some of the sexual tension and the demonstrations are necessary to introduce Hideko's troubled background, her love for Suki, and move the plot forward. And I'm not gonna lie, the sex industry thing was actually an incredibly interesting plot point, and I wonder if it's based on real-life practices of the rich and powerful in their off-screen time. Let me know in the comments if you know anything about that. And I will admit the relationship between Hideko and Suki does kinda rely on lust as a theme of the movie, but also as a plot point for them escaping and running off together at the end of the film. And one thing I've learned with Park Chan-wook is that the indulgence factor is real with this man's movies. When showing things that could be seen as controversial, this director will go out on a limb to show the most of that thing he can squeeze into the film. In Oldboy, the guy did not need to cut off his tongue. It was done for shock value and effect. It really didn't add anything to the plot except an "oh my god, that happened" moment. And similarly, in The Handmaiden, we as the audience did not really need to see two women fully immersing themselves in using toys on each other. Yikes. The romance was good enough without the excessive sex. Whether you're into that kind of stuff or not, I ain't judging. I'm just saying with a completely straight face right now that the story did not need it. Now, Park has said in interviews that the reason he wanted these scenes to be so dramatic and overdone was to emphasize the emotions and freedom that the two women were experiencing during sex. In his own words, quote unquote, "I wanted to do a sex scene where the process is the joy of it, the kind of sex where you can feel the intimacy between the two characters, where it is, as you see, a game. Sex where you laugh a lot, talk a lot, and even cry sometimes," unquote. And Park doesn't just say this about the sex scenes, the violence he emphasizes is a way of him being able to stress the character's emotions. He's not as interested in the over-the-top aspect as what the person must be feeling when they are in the middle of a certain experience. Still, to me, watching the finished product and probably a bunch of other people, it kinda just seems like it was put in for shock value. And yeah, I can definitely see where Park's coming from. Capturing human emotion in extreme situations does make for great filmmaking. It's why films like Birdman, Whiplash, and Black Swan are some of my favorites, because they emphasize the idea of being psychologically pushed to the absolute limit. But sex using toys on a boat? Man, I just don't know. Like, yes, it got me attention, and yes, the first time I watched this movie was with my family, and I was really uncomfortable the whole time. So thanks for that, Park. I know sex was a plot point, okay? I know it was a plot point. It was necessary in this film. But this much was just overkill, period. Even after all that, though, I still love this movie. Despite all my little gripes, it is still one of my all-time favorite films. I wouldn't have praised it as a near masterpiece if I didn't feel this way. The three-part non-linear storytelling mechanic is fascinating, with the riveting plot, dynamic characters, and dark undertones culminating to create an extremely engaging experience. Now, it's not perfect, but few movies are. And one thing I love about this is it breaks the barrier of traditional storytelling format in a unique and refreshing way. This movie is genuinely of its own kind, and I wish I could talk to more people about it. I really, really like this movie. I think it's great, and I think Park did a great job, and I'm definitely looking forward to what he and his team are going to come up with in the future. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know down in the comments below if you like The Handmaiden and what other movies, Korean or otherwise, you find to be great stories. Like, subscribe, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.